Chapter 2. My parents, Robert and Sally Stern, were high school sweethearts and married after they had each finished college. Dad worked as an architect and Mom as an accountant. They settled down in a small suburban neighborhood in the dream house that my father had imagined, complete with plenty of space to raise a family. The house had 2 floors, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, a kitchen, living room, a 2-car garage, and 2 spacious yards with a patio in the back and a porch in the front that stretched to match the length of the house. Mom and Dad had been settled in the house for 3 years before I was born. I was named after my great-grandfather on my father's side, Stephen. Mom had never admitted this to anyone, and I believe she still wouldn't to this day, but I think that deep down she had always wanted a daughter and was disappointed that I didn't turn out as such. Mom had always wanted a younger sister growing up, but remained an only child. She wanted someone with whom she could really relate with in ways she couldn't do with men. She wanted someone with whom she could pass down her exclusive secrets to, secrets that wouldn't mean anything to a son or a younger brother. That's not to say that my mother always hated me, especially not at first. I was confident that she loved me just as much as a mother should, but as I grew older I began to learn things about my mother just from watching her actions, emotions, and expressions. There were secrets about Mom that I had picked up upon examining her character from a distance, and by the time I was old enough, I saw my mother in a way that would change how I felt about her for the rest of my life. I never confronted her about such discoveries as a kid because I knew she would instantly deny them for the sake of preserving my perfect little world of innocence. After all, a mother's worst fear is for her child to believe that they are not loved by her. I suppose the same could be said for a father as well as any guardian for that matter. My father, on the other hand, was thrilled to have a son. He had fantasized about all the activities and bonding him and I would do together as I grew older. Playing catch in the front yard, fishing trips every summer, learning how to fix just about every appliance and machine under the sun. It wasn't that I hated doing these things with Dad, but I just never felt like they were our own memories. My dad remembers doing all these exact things with his father, so to me, it felt like I was just sharing my father's memories instead of making my own with him. That being said, I now consider those times as the golden years with him, and I was always more comfortable around my father. I always turned to him for advice whenever I had a problem, and he understood my interests and habits much more easily than Mom did. Mom tried to spend time with me whenever she could, and while I certainly never hated those times at that age, it always felt like there was a certain disconnection between her and I that we never fully understood or overcame. Things with Dad were just naturally easier despite Mom's best interest at heart. It didn't take much for me to be the center of attention as a newborn. I was the first grandchild on both sides of my family, and since my mom absolutely resented dogs, it's not like there was a puppy in the house to garner attention. Despite being quite young in age, my still developing mind didn't take long to pick up on the fact that my parents had high expectations for me. They would dress me, feed me, and teach me to speak and walk in a certain way, all the while entertaining this notion that, as the first grandchild, I supposedly had certain expectations to meet in order to make the family proud. I naturally gave into it at first when I was much too young to do anything to rebel, but as I grew older, I got pretty sick of the act. By the time I was 5 years old, I had developed a resistance to the numerous requests of my parents, which frustrated them. I wasn't a troublemaker by any means, and I learned a lot based on their teachings, but I certainly didn't want to be the perfect, petty golden boy that Mom and Dad wanted me to be. I quickly made friends with the neighborhood kids, who all conveniently lived within walking distance of my house. Joey Brzezinski, Michael Korus, and Nathan Schell made up my quaint little circle of friends. We did everything from street hockey in the cul-de-sac to riding our bikes as far as we could before getting scolded by our parents for wandering off too far, to countering the intense summer heat waves with a crammed inflatable swimming pool, ice cream, and cherry sodas. During the monsoon seasons, we'd take turns spending the day indoors at each other's houses. We played hide and seek, board games, and occasionally took turns with Mike's video game collection. While the 4 of us did attend the same school, we hardly ever got classes together. We improvised by spending as much time together at recess, lunch, and after school as we could, despite the challenge of conflicting schedules, homework, and household chores. There would be occasional arguments among us over trivial and childish things, such as the time Nathan claimed Joey stole his basketball and vowed never to speak to him again, but then made up 2 days after we discovered that Nathan's ball had been stuck in a tree and forgotten about for 3 months after a game got more chaotic than usual. Our fights never lasted too long since we were too close of friends to stay apart for longer than a few days. We weren't together all the time, though. Occasionally, Mike would have to leave with his family to visit relatives, Nathan would have out-of-town tournaments with the school basketball team and would be gone for a weekend, and there was also word that Joey's parents were discussing moving away in a few years, so we knew our days with Joey were numbered. As time passed and we grew older, I realized my friends weren't around nearly as much as they used to be. They had more responsibilities and weren't quite as rebellious to chores as I was with my parents. When I was 8, I started to grow lonely and developed some lazy habits as a result. The neighborhood streets used to be my home away from home, but I would soon go entire days without leaving my house. Getting up in the morning was beginning to be a chore, and with Dad gone at work most days, Mom was getting frustrated at having to motivate me by herself to do anything besides watch television all day. I didn't know what exactly, but I knew my parents were planning something one day when I noticed they began to act much more secretive around me than usual. They would chat together whenever they believed they were alone, and if I ever asked what they talked about, they would regurgitate the same excuses to remain as vague as possible, telling me things such as, "Just adult things, honey," or "Don't worry your silly little head about it, it's nothing." I would eavesdrop on them whenever I could, but still had no idea what was going on. At night, I would sneak out of my room, creep down the hall, and place my ear to their bedroom door, but all I could ever make out was the word change being thrown around every other sentence. Dad was making vague proposals about something, but would never be specific. Mom seemed hesitant, yet willing at the same time. All their secret planning was beginning to drive me crazy. One night while I was falling asleep, I had decided I'd had enough of being left out of some supposedly big developments that my parents were orchestrating. So I decided I would confront them the next morning and demand to know what their precious changes entailed. But when morning came, Mom wasn't home. Dad was sitting at the table reading the newspaper while nursing a cup of coffee. When I asked him where Mom was, he told me she was at the doctor's office. At that moment, the only thing I could hypothesize in my 8-year-old mind was that Mom was somehow injured or sick. I asked Dad why Mom was at the doctor's office, but all he could tell me was that she had an appointment and it was just about time for him to go pick her up. Dad wouldn't let me come with him to pick Mom up from the doctor, no matter how much I begged him. Instead, my father had arranged for me to stay at Mike's house under the supervision of his parents until my parents returned, since I wasn't trusted enough to stay home by myself. Mike tried to calm my nerves by offering to play games while I visited him, but my father's suspicious actions had me too distracted, my skin crawling with uncertainty. I could barely stomach the turkey sandwiches Mike's mom had prepared for us because my stomach was doing backflips with anticipation at the return of my secretive parents. Eventually, my family's car rolled up in the driveway later that afternoon, and my parents had barely exited the vehicle before I raced over and began asking questions. Once inside the house, my parents shared a couch in the living room and asked me to take a seat in the chair across from the coffee table so they could finally tell me the big news. I could barely sit still, though, as my excitement came to a boil. At that moment, my life changed forever, even if I didn't realize it in what manner exactly right away. Mom and Dad explained to me that I was going to be a brother. I couldn't believe it. The first question that came to my dumbfounded mind was how such a revelation could have developed so quickly under my radar. But when I asked my parents this directly, my father simply stated that the question was too mature for my age, and that I would learn when I was older. More than anything, though, I couldn't decide how I felt about the very idea of another child living in the same house as me, with the same parents. At first thought, I believe they did this because Mom had grown tired of me and wanted a new son, but it wasn't long before she reassured me that a new family member would be good for all of us. As it turns out, Mom and Dad always wanted to have 2 children, but they didn't decide until now when the right time was to have the second one. My father even designed the house with an extra bedroom that was currently empty because he made plans to accommodate another family member before I was even born. My mother claimed that being a brother meant I would always have someone to spend time with, and I wouldn't need to be lonely anymore. But all I could think about was how things would change. I wasn't willing to share this home with another. What right did some kid have to walk right in and start claiming my food, my clothes, and my family as their own? No one had even asked me how I felt about this. Was I just going to be shoved aside and left to be forgotten? I didn't even know who this person was, but I hated him or her already. Every day since the news of a new family member was dropped, I began to fear for my own safety. I would wake up every morning and dread walking into the kitchen out of fear of seeing a different little boy or girl sitting in my place at the table. One day I walked down the upstairs hallway and opened the unpainted door to the room that I never knew existed until that moment. The room was cold, empty, and lifeless. It was here all along, yet I never noticed it. In fact, upon first glance, I thought it had magically appeared overnight. It looked so out of place with the rest of the house in my eyes, and I just couldn't picture another human being actually living here. Perhaps it was because that human wouldn't live in this one. I assumed the new child would be taking my room instead, and this barren space would become my new one. If Mom and Dad were so excited to have a new son or daughter, they might as well give him or her the best possible accommodations for a child they could provide. But for the longest time, this prophesized kid was nowhere to be seen. Every time I turned a corner and expected to find this new child, there was no one there. The excuse I was always given when I asked about the child's whereabouts was always the same: not here yet. Just where was this new kid coming here from, and what was taking him or her so long to get here? More importantly, why did I even care at all? This son or daughter was supposedly going to take everything away from me, and yet, as much as I wanted to hate this mysterious being, I couldn't help but find myself curious to know more about it. I didn't know how to accept a new child into my life, what life would be like once this new kid did eventually arrive, and I was starting to forget how peaceful my life was before any of this started happening. It had been 9 months since the trouble began, and I had just nearly forgotten about the imminent arrival of another child when, early one morning, Mom was rushed to the hospital. She was screaming and holding her rather large abdomen with her hands, obviously experiencing some immense pain I didn't understand. I tried to ask what was going on, but Dad was too stricken with panic to explain. He told me to get in the car and tore out around the corner of the neighborhood and into the pitch-black streets of night. Later, I sat alone in a terribly uncomfortable chair of the waiting room for what felt like years but was only a few hours in reality. Under the bright fluorescent lighting and commotion penetrating my ears from all directions, I thought it would be impossible to get some sleep while waiting for Mom and Dad to return, but eventually I did finally doze off. Dad woke me up prematurely from my slumber and asked me if I was ready to meet my new little sibling. I shot right up out of my seat and followed my father to the hospital room where Mom was waiting. She was resting in a single bed centered in the middle of the room. I took a quick look around the room and saw no new kid sitting in the chairs up against the wall, as I expected. Just as I was about to ask where the child was for the millionth time, Mom motioned for me to step forward to the bedside. She was cradling a tiny newborn boy, resting peacefully in her arms, wrapped entirely in a navy blue blanket. It was decided that the boy would be named Bradley, after my great-grandfather on my mother's side. I tried my hardest to rub the sleep from my drowsy eyes and took a first glance at my new little brother. Instantly, all of my previous fears and premature feelings melted away. I expected to meet a menacing, cynical 8-year-old, and instead I found a precious baby. Precious, just as my parents felt I was when I was born. How could this innocent baby cause me any sort of suffering like I imagined? I couldn't see Bradley eating nearly as much as I could, and I knew he was much too small to wear my clothes. I was astounded by Bradley's innocent demeanor and felt foolish for originally feeling so threatened by him. I felt a sneaking suspicion that life would turn out much differently than I had originally anticipated. Mom called my name, snapping me out of the trance of thought I was apparently trapped in, while staring at the baby. She asked me if I wanted to hold Bradley, and I hesitantly acquiesced. He was slightly heavier than I thought, and I immediately sat down in the chair behind me, out of fear I would drop him if I kept standing. Bradley woke up for a brief moment and was slightly upset at being held by someone other than his mother, but I gently rocked him back to sleep almost naturally. His exhaustion had spread to me, however, as I soon dozed off, still cradling my brother in my arms. Dad picked Bradley up and returned him to Mom's care. He then woke me up and the two of us went home. Still half asleep during the car ride home, I asked Dad why Mom and Bradley weren't coming with us, and he quietly assured me they'd come home in a few days.